Notre deuxième présentation est par Marion Sandilands, qui va présenter l'article 23, la langue et la canadienneté. Marion Sandilands travaille au sein du cabinet Conway à Ottawa, où elle travaille à l'intersection du droit, de la politique et du politique. Elle a plaidé devant de nombreux tribunaux, y compris la QUESCREN du Canada, et enseigne le droit constitutionnel à l'Université d'Ottawa. Elle donne son opinion et publie des textes sur les diverses questions de droit constitutionnel, de droit public et de droit administratif. Collaboratrice principale chargée du droit constitutionnel au groupe de réflexion section 1, elle a apporté son expertise dans le cadre d'enjeux constitutionnels au David Asper Center for Constitutional Rights de l'Université de Toronto, au Center for Constitutional Studies de l'Université de l'Alberta, ainsi qu'à la revue de droit de McGill. Marion?
Merci aux organisateurs pour leur travail acharné et merci de m'avoir invité à participer à cette conférence. So I'm a lawyer, so I start with a caveat. I do advise and represent some minority language groups in this room, including the QCGN and the QESPA. But the views I express today are manifestly my own and should not be attributed to any of my clients. They can fire me after. Si vous regardez le programme en français, je suis un point rouge. And if you look at the English program, there are blue dots. I think this is by language of presentation. I'm wearing red, blue, and yellow dots today, so we have to figure it out. So Canadian-ness, Canadian-ness, what was I getting at with this title? What does Canadian-ness have to do with Section 23? So I'm on the scientific committee for this conference, and this paper topic today was inspired by something somebody, Raphael, said earlier this year about what was this conference about. The idea was in many of its ambitious and I would say constitution stretching reforms, the CAC government keeps running into a roadblock of Section 23. Why is that? Why has there been this explosion of Section 23 litigation in Quebec in the past few years? And when I submitted this paper topic earlier in 2025, I wanted to take up this question, thank you, and put the current moment into the sort of broader constitutional and historical context. So Canadian-ness, what a quaint idea. But then the tariffs happened. Threats of 51st state, everything has changed. And we now have seen a sudden rise in Canadian patriotism. So now everybody is talking about Canadian. So back to my question, what does language have to do, language and Section 23 have to do with Canadian-ness? And why are we seeing so much Section 23 litigation in Quebec states? My roadmap today, first I want to explore around the topic of Section 23 and Canadian-ness from a legal and historical perspective. And then I want to return to that provocative question, why has there been so much Section 23 litigation in Quebec? So first, Section 23 and Canadian-ness, le bilan. Outside of our circle of bubble of experts, Section 23 is very little known. It's a very little known provision of the Charter. It's barely taught in law schools or universities. It's considered rather niche. But actually my thesis today is that Section 23 is part of the immutable backbone of the Charter. It is, I say quietly, a major anchor for the Charter itself and a quote linchpin, I will use that word that Supreme Court has used, the linchpin of Canadian bilingualism. In other words, in true Canadian fashion, Section 23 is quietly indispensable to Canadian-ness. To support my argument, I will talk about three things. First, what the Supreme Court has said about the unifying purpose of Section 23. Second, the political purposes of Section 23. And third, the exclusion of Section 23 from the ambit of the Charter's notwithstanding clause. So first, what has the Supreme Court said about Section 23? So Supreme Court has issued many generous, wonderful decisions about Section 23 and has described it as the quote linchpin of Canada's commitment to bilingualism and biculturalism. And that goes all the way back to the Mahay case that Eric talked about earlier. Supreme Court has said that Section 23 has three purposes, one of which is a unifying purpose. The other two purposes being the preventive and remedial purposes. Now, my personal gripe, the preventive and remedial purposes have gotten a lot of attention in the case law and jurisprudence, but I'm going to focus on the unifying purpose. So in the 2020 decision of Conseil francophone de la Colombie Britannique, Chief Justice Wagner said about the unifying purpose, I quote, this section 23, also has a unifying purpose in that it accommodates mobility by enabling citizens to move anywhere in the country without fearing that they will have to abandon their language and culture. So there's a clear link between Section 23 and mobility within Canada, because it enables English and French speakers to move around Canada and maintain their linguistic identity. And so really concretely, it means that families can move around the country and keep their children in the school, the language of their choice. So a francophone military family from Quebec can be moved to Alberta and enroll their kids in French school, and vice versa. And this kind of mobility brings understanding between Canadians. Now, secondly, so that's the Supreme Court's pronouncements on the unifying purpose. Secondly, move to the political purpose, Section 23. We know that one of the political purposes of the Charter itself was national unity. It was about engendering a pan-Canadian view of civic nationalism. It was supposed to be a unifying project, giving Canadians something to be attached to that is not British, not French, not American, Canadian, the Canadian Charter. If you've ever watched the video of the day that the Charter was adopted at the House of Commons, it was a unanimous and very loud and very bilingual singing about Canada. I recommend it. Now, but many critics, including Guy Laforêt, Suji Chowdhury, and Benoit Pelletier, have all argued that this unifying project fell very short because it was done without the consent of the National Assembly. And we are still, I would argue, still living the consequences of that. I'll circle back to that later. Now, so that's the political purpose of the Charter, mixed success. What was the political purpose of Section 23 specifically? It's often said the first reaction you might have is, oh, it was to counteract provinces' attempts to repress linguistic minorities. So we think particularly Ontario, Manitoba, yes, Quebec, and New Brunswick, most likely. And it's true, for example, there's no getting around the fact that the language of Section 23(1)B and Section 23(2) are modeled directly on the language from the Charter of the French language. And if those of you who were around in 1984 will remember this vividly, the Quebec Protestant School Board's case. So they're clearly, that language in the Charter is clearly a response to Quebec's attempt to limit access to English schools in Quebec. And the Charter requires, the only difference was that the Charter requires as a constitutional minimum that any Canadian citizens who have received their education in English anywhere in Canada have the right to send their kids to English school in Quebec. And vice versa, of course. Now, zooming out one level from that sort of micro situation of Section 23. Remember, Section 23 is said to be the, quote, linchpin of Canada's commitment to bilingualism and biculturalism. Where did that modern commitment come from? What are the political purposes of that commitment? So it's not even 10 a.m. and I'm not even the first person to bring up the Laurendeau-Dunton Commission. That commission was struck in the 1960s. I don't think I need to tell anyone in this room about this. There's a quiet revolution happening in Quebec. Francophone Quebecers are demanding emancipation, rights, status within Quebec and within Canadian institutions. Famously, CN. Quebec separatism movement is really gaining steam at this point. And its preliminary report, the commission blows the whistle on this. They they say, and I quote, le Canada traverse actuellement, sans toujours en être conscient, la crise majeure de son histoire. Cette crise a sa source dans le Québec. Elle a des foyers secondaires, les minorités françaises et les autres provinces et les minorités ethniques, ce qui ne signifie aucunement qu'à nos yeux, ces provinces soient eux-mêmes secondaires. Si elles persistent et s'accentuent, elles peuvent conduire à la destruction du Canada. Okay. So, to simplify, the commitment to bilingualism and biculturalism that came out of that mission is existential to Canada. It's not a luxury, it's not an extra. It holds Canada together. And so in that way, that is how I understand Section 23 to be the linchpin of that. So that's the political purpose of Section 23. Third and finally, the exclusion of Section 23 from the ambit of the notwithstanding clause. So nobody was talking about this 6 years ago. What happened? Bill 21 happened. All of a sudden, everybody notices that, whoa, Section 23 is not subject to the notwithstanding clause. Wow. So Section 33 primer, Section 33 is the provision of the charter that says that legislature can declare a provision operates notwithstanding certain sections of the charter. Section 215. So by invoking Section 33, sort of like the magic wand of the Constitution, a legislature can declare that the law operates notwithstanding the charter. So they can do that for things like equality rights, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, the right to be free from unreasonable arrest, the right to life, but not the right to minority language education. So language rights, along with democratic rights and mobility rights, are the three types of rights that can't be overridden by Section 33. And in some recent case law, including Conseil scolaire francophone, the Supreme Court has said that the exclusion of Section 23 from the ambit of the notwithstanding clause makes it somehow extra special, but it's not immediately clear why it would be so special. So back in 2019, Stephen Thompson asked me, hey, Marion, why is Section 23 excluded from the ambit of Section 33? And I said, Stephen, I have no idea. I can't find any explanation in the literature. So, like the good nerd that I am, I wrote a paper about it. And in my paper, I was looking for what's the commonality between these three types of rights? What makes them special and enough to be excluded from the ambit of Section 33? And the answer I came up with is, well, federalism. So the Supreme Court has said that federalism is about reconciling unity with diversity. So let's apply that framework to the ambit of Section 33. Let's say provinces can use Section 33 to assert their diversity, their local concerns. Let's say that's an argument I borrowed from Benoit Pelletier. And in that premise, well, the excluded rights, including the language rights, are the no-go zone for the provinces. They're part of in that way, they're part of the glue that holds Canada together. They're the unity side of that equation. So the right to move between provinces, the right to vote, and the right to have your children educated in the language of your choice, those are glue. And in this way, the charter is layered over our federal system. And those non-derogable rights, those special rights, are the sort of unity backbone of the charter. And Section 23 is one of them. Okay, coming back to the present moment, to get to that provocative question. I don't have the complete picture, but I know that there's active Section 23 litigation in many provinces right now. I think BC, Alberta, Northwest Territories, Ontario, and Quebec. So it's not exclusively a Quebec thing. And in fairness, Section 23 is a thorn in many provinces' side. To put it delicately, provinces are not always on board with this idea of official bilingualism and minority language rights. So this phenomenon is by no means confined to Quebec. But there's a difference, I think, between the litigation that's going on in Quebec and elsewhere. And elsewhere outside of Quebec tends to be about asserting the right to facilities, construction of schools, sometimes admissibility of students. And in Quebec, it's almost exclusively about management and control. And when I started in this field, there was no litigation in Quebec on this topic. There was about a 10-year hiatus. The last case I'm aware of before the current wave was the Marion case, 2009. So it's about a 10-year hiatus. And then this explosion starting in 2019, 2020. So what's going on in Quebec such that these claims are arising? And I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I think Raphael kind of stole my thunder. And I'm going to say that it has something to do with the CAC government. Okay. So the CAC, this is mine. The CAC has done some very innovative things around the Constitution. And we'll pull 3 of note. There are probably more, and I would love your take on this. 3 that I'm going to pull out would be the unilateral constitutional amendments, the innovative use of the notwithstanding clause, and acquiring the power to select Supreme Court judges. So first, some of you in this room nodded when I talked about unilateral constitutional amendments. What does that have to do with Section 23? Hopefully we'll get back to that. So in 2022, actually Quebec did this twice in 2022. In Bill 96, there is an amendment to the text of the Constitution Act 1867 that asserts that Quebec was formed a nation and French is the only official language. Now, despite what may have been reported or talked about in the media, this was really, really innovative move by Quebec. It had never been attempted by any province before to simply write in a clause of Canada's constitution without seeking approval or negotiation with any other level of government, right? This was quite innovative. And it has been challenged, and to this day, no one's quite sure of the legal status of that. So they did that once in Bill 96, and then they did it again, much more quietly, to exempt National Assembly members from taking an oath to the sovereign. Okay. The second major constitutional move I'm noticing is 2 and now, well, 3 major unprecedented uses of the notwithstanding clause. That's the preemptive and super broad override of the Canadian and the Quebec Charter in Bill 21 and 96. And the third one on the way, Bill 94, it's on the list. And I've argued elsewhere in this book, if you want to read all about it, you can also read Rousseau's response in this book about the notwithstanding clause, about how I think this is a constitutional move by Quebec. Using the Constitution itself, but to kind of reshape Quebec's own legal status and its own constitution, if you will. I've called it a constitutional underwater volcano in the sense that it's a big deal. You don't really see it or understand what's happening, but one day you can just look down for the ocean floor and it's just not quite where you thought it was anymore. But I don't take credit for this volcano image. Professor Guillaume Rousseau actually coined the term in his paper defending the use of notwithstanding clause in 2019. He'll be here later today. We'll have a good chat. And thirdly, more quietly, and I don't think anyone in this room might be aware of this, but Quebec has acquired the power to select Supreme Court judges. This happened in 2019 through a very quietly done federal provincial agreement. And in my writings, I've noticed that this was one of the 5 asks from Meach, right? This is something that's been achieved through the sort of para-constitutional way, something that Quebec negotiated for and did get in Meach. Meach failed, it's happened, right? So we can link a lot of these things back to some of the constitutional projects that Quebec has had for a long time. There's more efforts underway. So Quebec is requesting power for immigration, requesting the power to appoint federally appointed judges, and the report of the Comité consultatif sur les enjeux constitutionnels du Québec au sein de la Fédération canadienne, which I loosely translate as the Committee on How to Achieve Sovereignty Association Without a Referendum. They made 42 recommendations. Recommendation 11 is a proposal to amend Section 23 to make it apply asymmetrically in Quebec. Recommendation 10, by the way, is to apply the notwithstanding clause to Quebec's entire statute book. And I wasn't surprised to see either of these recommendations in that report. So to get me back to my topic, Section 23 and Canadian-ness, why is all this litigation happening? As the CAC attempts to quietly stretch the Constitution to disintegrate Quebec from Canada, it is no coincidence that the CAC is running into roadblocks on Section 23. for the CAC, the section 23 has proven to be one of the hardest constitutional provisions to circumvent. Hence the recommendation to modify it to weaken its power in Quebec. Now, things have changed dramatically, thanks to a certain orange-faced friend himself. With the threat of Canada becoming the 51st state, made by a military superpower that just so happens to share the longest undefended border in the world with us, Donald Trump has put Canadian-ness back at top of mind. And with the fear of losing things like official bilingualism and healthcare, Canadians are rediscovering their identity. It's no longer quaint. It's important now. And in a very topsy-turvy turn of events, Albertans have surpassed Quebecers in their request for sovereignty. So things have changed a lot, I think, in the last few months. With all of this, Section 23 remains a bulwark in our federalist structure. And I would argue still remains quietly indispensable to Canadian unity. And I'll end on maybe a cliche. I'm trying to make it bilingual. What Section 23 has joined together, let no province put asunder. Ce que l'article 23 a uni, qu'aucune province ne le sépare. Thank you.